of Canadians. This is a fundamental falsity, Madam Speaker, because what this would do, what enacting an anti-net neutrality bill would do, would ensure that the government was dictating how companies did their business online. It would ensure that the average corporation would be forced to pay extra to simply compete in the same space as the colossal giants of tech and of business that we see today. Tech, Mr. Speaker, is now the most valuable industry on our stock markets today. It is the most valuable industry, surpassing energy. And when we see an industry that is that valuable, we have to take special consideration with how we and how the government approaches it. Yes.
If it is our most important industry, shouldn't we take advantage of that innovation and push that innovation with a resolution?
Once again, they are falsely equating this idea that if we somehow limit how companies are able to compete in a space, that we're going to somehow enable innovation. The fact of the matter is, in Canada, 90% of our ISPs are controlled by 3 companies. 90%. Guess what they will not have to do? They will not have to innovate because they already are the kings of the marketplace. I'll discuss that as we move further on, but it is a fundamental falsity with the idea of competition that they keep repeating and repeating and repeating. But let's disregard this fact that there is no magic switch. Even if there was, even if we said the lower speeds offered were still higher than the speeds we get today, we're going to look at a comparative advantage that will still occur and still exist. That comparative advantage will still mean that when a consumer has a choice between Netflix and Amazon TV, the company that paid the ISP more is going to be their choice because it's going to be faster. That relative difference is still going to be a huge focal point for the consumer. We've seen that historically, Mr. Speaker. We saw that when we went from dial-up to high speed, consumers are going to pursue the best option available when given the chance. I'd like to conclude my clash with looking at a real-life case example now of this idea that somehow consumers would not eat the costs. This notion that consumers would not end up with the costs is once again ridiculous. We see it already in the Canadian marketplace. We see it with the telecommunications marketplace that we're currently discussing, Mr. Speaker. Consumers in Canada pay 5 times more for every megabyte of data that they consume than someone in Finland does, than someone in India does. Why? Because that oligopoly gets to dictate the price. That oligopoly gets to dictate how the market is actually going to play out, and consumers in Canada have to just accept that. If we're saying that this will not pass extra costs on the consumer, let me paint you a hypothetical scenario. You're a customer with Bell. You've used the service for years, and now there's this limitation. Companies are paying Bell as to what speeds they can actually offer. Mr. Speaker, now your plan's going to offer, it goes from monthly, say $130 a month, to now $130 a month, and if you want to watch Netflix, that's an extra $10. And if you want to use Amazon shopping service, that's an extra $10, Mr. Speaker. And that notion, why can cost would pass to consumers? Yes.
Mr. Speaker, is the delegate aware that they're not charging the consumers extra price? The websites are they're charging the websites to use that extra speed.
So let's break this down. If a website is paying an ISP to get their speed through faster, if that is the case, then the consumer who wants to get an alternate service, if Amazon is paying for their speed to be increased and a consumer is interested in having Netflix, they're going to have to pay extra for Netflix because that is the cost the company is not receiving. That is why consumers get gouged at the end of the day. We have to understand that. But even if we have these ideas, I move more to my constructive speech here, it's inherently dangerous for the consumer, Madam Speaker. Mr. Speaker, pardon me, long day, I apologize. It is inherently dangerous for the consumer. Think about how consumers gather their media today. Think about how consumers actually consume the world today, Mr. Speaker. It is through the internet. More people are on the internet, more people on Facebook than they ever have been before. If Facebook controlled every social media market, because they would, they're the largest player, if they controlled how consumers can actually access those marketplaces, they would have incredible bias. Whatever Facebook decided was right would become what consumers actually got to consume and got to consume at their luxury. Let me pose this. This sounds ridiculous, but what if, Mr. Speaker, a politician got to decide every piece of media that was allowed through this program? How ridiculous does that sound? Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is, it's not ridiculous at all, because if this were to pass, SaskTel and the Quebecer are the 2 largest internet service providers in their country, in their provinces, pardon me, and they would control which companies actually got to go forward. Those SaskTel and the Quebecer respectively control between 60 and 65% of their local marketplace, Mr. Speaker. If we're allowing that to spread, then those are crown corporations. Those are the political giants of the province actually deciding how a consumer gets to consume. When we have that kind of idea in play, it is inherently incredibly dangerous for the consumer. Consumers lose their opportunity to freely choose what information they consume. Bell Media owns CTV. Do you think a Bell customer is going to be able to access CBC very quickly? No, they will not. They're going to once again have this complication of biased media. And when that bias is created, so Canadians as a whole lose the opportunity to learn freely and learn what the methods the internet has currently allowed. Mr. Speaker, the burden we placed on side government today was that they must prove that the resolution will make the internet better for Canadian businesses and citizens. What this resolution actually does is it creates immense barriers to entry for new companies. It creates immense bias for consumers as they try to reach and try to understand the world around them. And fundamentally, it hurts every Canadian's opportunity to actually compete in their marketplaces. This, Mr. Speaker, is why we believe this resolution must fall. That we are not going to remain neutral on net neutrality. Thank you.
Thank you, third member of opposition. Side opposition, no time for your rebuttal.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take a step back and sort of do a 30,000-foot flyover of tonight's debate, explain some of the roles and responsibilities that each side has, as well as discuss some of the themes and big ideas that were discussed tonight in tonight's debate. Side government has the duty to prove the burden which we provided to them. And that burden was prove that this resolution will make the internet better for Canadians and for Canadian businesses. We on side opposition believe that not only have they failed to do that, but we have failed to conclusively prove that it will do the exact opposite, and that is why side opposition has won today's debate, Mr. Speaker. Now, I'd like to start with this notion of the definitions given by side government, which were that the lower speeds were going to be higher speeds, and the higher speeds were going to be even higher speeds. Okay, so we're going to say, even if we accept that definition, Mr. Speaker, how have we on side opposition won today's debate? The leader of side government came up and talked about how this is a tool that can give companies a competitive advantage, that companies can use for marketing. But they failed to ignore the reality of the online space today that is dominated by large companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Wish.com, other large companies, Walmart, who can afford to pay their way through the marketplace, and it is incredibly difficult for small firms to compete. So we believe that those are in fact not points for their side, but points for our side, Mr. Speaker, and do not do anything to prove that this resolution should pass. Secondly, the second speaker came to talk about how this would help consumers, without noting, Mr. Speaker, that, and in fact, blatantly denying without explanation that somehow the extra costs of paying, which is noted in the resolution, will not be passed on to the consumer and will somehow be absorbed by the firm. Something that is fundamentally untrue, as explained by multiple speakers on side opposition. And therefore, being more expensive cannot benefit the Canadian citizens or Canadian businesses, and therefore not proving the resolution. Mr. Speaker, there's also the notion that everyone will benefit from this, which is actually a direct quote from, I believe, the Prime Minister. Again, ignoring people and companies who cannot afford to pay. Further proving a misunderstanding of what the effect this resolution will have, and a misunderstanding of their roles and how they were supposed to be conducting today's debate. But what have we done inside opposition? We've shown that, in fact, there are serious harms that will be caused by this resolution. Mr. Speaker, our Prime Minister our leader of the opposition talked about how this gives ISP providers, which both sides noted are an oligopoly in Canada, too much power of how information flows across the internet to the people in our society. Something that is extremely dangerous and something that side government did not combat us on. They also talked about how this allows for preferential treatment. Mr. Speaker, we also talked about how making small firms less competitive is bad for Canadian workers and bad for Canadian businesses, and how the oligopoly can dictate the price, the ISP oligopoly can dictate the price of services in Canada. All points that received very little effective combat from side government. For these reasons, Mr. Speaker, and all other reasons noted by side opposition today, we cannot stay neutral on this issue. Net neutrality should be for all. Thank you.
Thank you, side opposition. Side government, your rebuttal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So it's kind of surprising for the opposition to state that they think that they've won this debate because they've brought in a few points that have really brought some contradiction in this resolution today in the House. So the first speaker really started off with talking about how telecommunication companies or internet service providers essentially work together for standard price fixing. But since there is really no core or proof or hard evidence of this said statement, technically that is colluding, and colluding is illegal. So that statement itself is very contradicting to this resolution. The second point that was brought up by the opposition was that this would increase barriers to entry for new companies, and that it would only make it harder for small business to grow, and it's essentially bad for the economy. But as my colleague had stated, this is a fundamental strategy of capitalism. And Canada is, yes, it is a capitalistic country. Yes, it does take advantage of capitalistic policies. And yes, it does believe in the ideology of capitalism. So, as my colleague has stated before, you get what you pay for. So if you have the money on hand to really pay for the service, then you should be able to take advantage of this. And this should give you a competitive edge for your company to succeed. And another point that was brought up by the opposition is that essentially this is dangerous for consumers because this can form bias. But essentially, if you think about it in a certain way, bias is unquantifiable. You can't really measure bias because bias essentially can form with some people, but it can't form with others. So in terms of bias being used as a constructive argument for their debate, we think that this point does not essentially relate to the resolution just because it is not measurable. But to get into our constructive arguments, we talked about the differentiation of websites and companies because this leads to a competitive edge. And that also entails within capitalism. It entails within the market or the business strategy of Canadian businesses. And the second point we brought up was a better internet experience for everyone. Yes, they brought up the fact that essentially university tuition could increase, but we've also talked about the fact that new revenue streams for these internet service providers could essentially lead to cheaper access, because now they don't require that revenue from their consumers, from the residential consumers. Instead, they're getting it from their commercial consumers, and they're able to make up for that, which essentially could lead to cheaper access for students, or even profs, or even the tech industry workers as well. So essentially, this resolution really entails the fundamental strategy of capitalism, because yes, you get what you pay for. And this does, and what the Canadian business economy is all about is it's about competition. It's about gaining the competitive edge, and that is exactly what this resolution is for. It's trying to gain that competitive edge for those companies to really boost forward. Yes, some small businesses may not have the resources or the cash on hand, but that doesn't mean that all small businesses don't. Some businesses might, and what it does is it creates that competitive edge for them to move forward. So to conclude, we just want to talk about how This is a differentiation strategy, that this really helps the Canadian economy and the Canadian businesses to really move forward and create a differentiation that will only help them succeed. Thank you.